All right. Nice. Well, again, lovely to see you guys. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you had a nice weekend. Ooh, I lost the minute. Okay. So, as I said, today, what I really want to try and do is talk to you a little bit, in this case, about what we can do with our TFL natural deduction system. So, in particular, what I want to talk to you about is spend most of the time talking about this idea of proof-theoretic notions. So these parallel semantic notions that we defined in the first 7 weeks. So if you remember, with regards to TFL, we had stuff like being a tautology. What was a tautology? Yeah.
Being true on every evaluation?
It's true in every evaluation. So it's a TFL sentence, it's true in every evaluation. We also had notions like being jointly consistent. What was it to be jointly tautologically consistent?
It was possible for all the sentences to be true.
Yeah, right? Nice. And finally, of course, we had the notion of tautological entailment. So what was tautological entailment? Yeah.
Basically, validity for.
Yeah, right? So it was defined to just be draw flat, right? It was impossible. There's no valuation that makes the sentences on the left-hand side of the double turnstile true and the sentence on the right false. So yeah, it's our kind of surrogate for validity. What we can do with natural deduction is everything that we could do with truth tables. All of that stuff we can recover back. Mostly. And one of the reasons we get interested in the natural deduction stuff, as we talked about last week, is it's a little bit better in some ways than the tables because you can see the reasons why. You're able to track the reasoning that gets you from premises to an argument. Or if, say, you have some sentences, if you have some sentences that are jointly tautologically inconsistent, if they're inconsistent, then it's going to be possible to show why. That is, to show how you get a contradiction from them. So that's what we're going to start with. I want to talk you through these proof-theoretic notions. And then I'm going to spend like 5 minutes, 10 minutes talking about some general proof-making strategies. This is sort of just general advice about how to construct natural deduction proofs. And that should get us to the break. And then, as I said, in the second half, what I want to do is go through some practice proofs just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. Cool? Beautiful. So, on to the proof-theoretic notions. So the first thing with our proof-theoretic notion is we're going to introduce the single turnstile. Now, you met the double turnstile in the first block. And it was the thing that expressed, if it's TFL, it expressed tautological entailment. If it was FOL, it expressed logical entailment. But it's basically the same idea. Just like your man said, like the double turnstile meant, hey, there's no way to make the sentences on the left true and the sentence on the right false. Well, the single turnstile is kind of the same, except it's going to be connected to our natural deduction system. It tells us, basically, is provable from. So you'll have some sentences on the left and a sentence on the right, and the single turnstile will hold if and only if you can build a natural deduction proof that takes the sentences on the left as your assumptions and ends with a sentence on the right as your conclusion. Basically, it holds if you can build a proof, if a proof is buildable. It's worth stressing that the single and the double turnstiles are different notions. They're intimately related, but they are different notions. When we're thinking about the double turnstile for TFL, it's defined in terms of valuations. And maybe a quick question, what's a valuation? When we're talking about TFL, what do we mean by that word? Yeah. Nice. So that's what it expresses, the row. But what is it? What does the row express? So you're on the right lines. Yeah? Good, but for what? Kind of. So let's kind of link these two together, right? Each row on the table What are they rows determined by?
The truth value of the atom.
Exactly, right? So a valuation is an assignment of truth values to atomic sentences. So that's really what the tables are, is they're tables about, hey, we built the sort of matrix, right? Where the atoms are true or false in various combinations, and that tells you what happens in the row. So the double turnstile concerns valuations, these assignments of truth values to atoms. But we don't have that when it comes to the single turnstile. Because remember, we're not really dealing with truth here. We just take some sentences and syntactically manipulate them using our rules. So we can't use this. Instead, we just use the natural deduction rules. Right? So again, different notions, single and double, different fundamental notions. But we can kind of go on. We can say, right, A1 through AN in my sexy swash font, and C in my sexy swash font. Put the single turnstile in between, and it tells us there is a proof, or there's a possible proof, that takes A1 through AN and ends in C. And we can also draw it with a line through it, and that tells us, hey, there is no way to build such a proof. Something interesting, and I'll tell you now. We can't show this using our natural deduction system. The best we can do is just keep trying and failing. But the system itself can't show you that this isn't possible. It's a bit like why a language can't tell you, oh, in this language you can't say, because obviously if you could then go on to say it in the language, it would be false. You could say it in the language. That's the kind of problem here. Our rule system can't tell you what it can't do. It can only show you. But again, if we put the single turnstile in between, it tells us you can take the stuff on the left as assumptions and end with the thing on the right. We can also use this notion to define up various proof-theoretic concepts. So our first one is being a theorem. And a TFL sentence is a theorem if and only if there's a proof for it starting from no assumptions whatsoever. So this is really fun because what we do when we prove that a sentence is a theorem, if you remember, the beginning of a natural deduction proof, we always start by kind of listing our assumptions and then drawing the assumption line. The proof for a theorem just starts like that. There's nothing above the assumption line. Our first numbered line is going to be below. Theorems are sentences we can literally bootstrap from nothing. So to show that a sentence is a theorem, we construct a proof that ends in that sentence from no assumptions whatsoever. Notably, to show that a sentence is not a theorem, well, we can't do that with our natural deduction system. How would we show, though? What tool would we have to show? Yeah.
My question was, is there a sentence that is not a theorem?
Absolutely.
Because you can make up anything to prove anything, right?
No, you can't make up anything to prove anything, right? Because you have to follow the rules. And it's not possible to use the rules to go from any sentence to any other sentence.
But in a theorem, you don't have to go from assumptions.
But you still have to use the rules. You can't just sort of make it up and go to anything. You have to follow only the rule steps that we talked about.
Yeah.
So there's not going to be ways to get to anything you like. For example, that sentence is not a theorem. Because we can even think about it. Why would this sentence not be a theorem? Here's a fun parallel. What notion is being a theorem parallel to? We talked about it about 2 minutes ago. Close. So it's not an atomic sentence. Yeah.
It needs an assumption because there needs to be some proof.
Kind of.
Yeah.
It has to be a tautology.
It has to be a tautology. right? Being a theorem is the parallel to being a tautology, right? Every sentence that's not a tautology isn't going to be a theorem. This is not a tautology. And we can show it's not a tautology because we could build a valuation where it's false. So this is the really neat parallel. The concepts we're going to define in terms of our natural deduction system have to parallel the semantic concepts we defined earlier. So being a theorem is going to be the natural deduction surrogate of being a tautology. And this is kind of cool because it literally means, right, if you can bootstrap this sentence from nothing, if you can assume nothing and get the sentence, then not only do you know it's a theorem, just to spoil something I'm going to say in a few slides, but you also know it's a tautology. But this does tell us something again, to kind of spool back. We can't show that a sentence is not a theorem using natural deduction. We can only show that it is. Yeah.
How can you work with no assumptions?
Good. So let me give you an example. Here's a very silly example. So we start off with nothing. We draw our assumption line, and our first move in this case is going to be, let's open a subproof. And our subproof in this case is designed to end in a contradiction. Because what I want to do at the very end is negation introduction. So, pro tip, 99.9% of the time when you're proving a theorem, your first move is going to be opening a subproof. Because you have to have something to work with. But notably, as soon as we get down to here, we've gotten rid of our additional assumption, we've discharged it. So we're back to not assuming anything at line 5. So yeah. Good. But importantly, wherever we're doing the subproofs, as soon as we close it and move away from it, we're decommitted from that additional assumption. This is why we use the separate subproof line. We show at this point, by ending that subproof line, I'm no longer committed to the additional assumption in line 1. This is also why, we talked a little bit about this last week, why you can't use individual sentences inside the subproof. Because so like sentence 3, in order for 3 to be true, you had to work with the assumption in line 1. So that's why we can't cite any individual sentences inside the subproof. They're reliant on that additional assumption. But we can cite the whole subproof, because it's just saying something like, if 1 is true, then da-da-da. And that can be true if 1's true or 1's false. So, again, to kind of come back, how do we work with no assumptions? Carefully. Most of the time, it means that we're going to have to kick open a subproof right off the bat, because we'll need some tool to work with. But of course, by the end of the proof, we're going to have to discharge that additional assumption. Close the subproof. Okay. So there's our first thing that we can do, natural deduction. We can show that sentences are theorems. And we show that TFL sentence is a theorem by proving from no assumptions whatsoever. Now it's worth going back a slide and showing you something. Note, I've kind of written I've written the single turnstile and then the sentence. If you see anything like this, the single turnstile with the sentence after it, and it's asking for you to prove blah, 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 what's it asking you to do? Yeah. So sometimes from now on, you'll get questions that are structured like this. And what is it asking you to do? It's asking you to prove that this sentence is a theorem. It's just like we've done before, but in this case, you don't have any tools to start with. It's 0 assumptions. Okay? Cool with our first idea? Theoremhood. The rough parallel to being a tautology. Yes?
In line 3, it says By proving the theorem part, so the next slide.
Oh, this one.
Yeah, on line 3 it says elimination on line 2. It should be 1 flow.
Yeah, that's a typo one. That one should be conjunction elimination from line 1. Beautiful. Okay. On to our second notion. So, just like we have a parallel with being a tautology, we're going to have a natural deduction parallel with another notion. In this case, we're going to have an idea about being provably equivalent. So, two TFL sentences, it's always going to be two. Two TFL sentences are provably equivalent if and only if each can be proved from the other. That is, if you have sentences A and B, they'll be provably equivalent if and only if you can give a proof that starts with A and ends with B, and a proof that starts with B and ends with A.
So it's 400 of.
So notably, to show that two sentences are provably equivalent, we've got to give two proofs. Which makes sense, because that's what it means to be provably equivalent. You can go this way and the other way back. So it's worth pausing and asking, what semantic concept is this parallel? What is this like? Yeah.
Tautological equivalence.
Tautological equivalence, right? Tautological equivalence. So remember, what was it when two sentences were tautologically equivalent? When are they and when aren't they?
They are tautologically equivalent. In every valuation, they have the same truth value.
Nice. So our natural deduction parallel is basically, hey, if A is true, then B must be true. And if B is true, then A must be true. We basically show a biconditional, a provability biconditional. It's worth noting that one thing we cannot do with our TFL natural deduction system is show that two sentences are not provably equivalent. And the reasoning here is because what we have to show is that it's impossible, that there's no possible proof that starts with A and gets to B, or vice versa. And this is, again, a bit like the language kind of saying, hey, here's something that you can't say. It's just simply beyond the power of the system. So, okay, give you an example of provable equivalence, just to kind of get the ball rolling. This one's a kind of jokey one, but it's just to kind of see how it goes. Two sentences that are provably equivalent. We have G and we have not G. So, in order to show this, what we have to do is, again, build two proofs. One that starts with the left and ends with the right. One that starts with the right and ends with the left. Pretty easy. For our first one, we do negation introduction, and to get us the for not G. On the other side, we just do double negation elimination twice. Notably, to answer these questions, to show that both sentences are provably equivalent, you need both proofs. That's why on the final exam, these ones are worth twice as much points, because there's two questions in one. I hope that's clear. Okay. So far, so good? Feeling okay? So, to prove a theorem? Yeah. To prove a theorem, right, we start with no assumptions, and you give me the sentence as the final step. To prove two sentences are provably equivalent, two proofs. One that starts with A and ends with B, one that starts with B and ends with A. Our third concept, again, has a parallel with what we did with TFL. It's an interesting one. So we'll say that some sentences, A1 through AN, are jointly contrary, if and only if you can take them and prove a contradiction from them. So A1 through AN are jointly contrary if and only if, you can take them as assumptions and your proof ends in the bomb, in the upside down T.
Ends there?
Hmm?
What do you mean by it ends in the bomb?
Ah, good. So remember, what's the bomb? The upside down T. It's a contradiction, right? So it ends there. What we're showing, well, it's a good question. What is it we're showing?
But there's no predicate, just the bomb.
There's no predicates. Remember, we're only dealing with TFL here, so ain't no predicates anywhere in here. Only atomic sentences.
Yeah.
So, but what are we showing? Effectively, what's the parallel here?
Or we just change the value of the rest.
It's kind of interesting.
Joint inconsistency?
Yeah, it's joint tautological inconsistency. We're showing that, hey, these can't all be true together. Because if they are all true together, what do you get? You get a contradiction. If they're all true together, something bad happens. So they must not all be true together. Do we see, again, the parallel here? So with the semantic concepts, if we're thinking about the tables, we would show that some sentences are jointly tautologically inconsistent by showing there's no valuation where they're all true together. Now what we do is we take them as assumptions and we derive a contradiction. Notably, it's very hard, in fact, it's impossible, to show that some sentences are not jointly contrary. We can show that you can prove something from these sentences, but that doesn't show it's possible to make them all true together. So this is, again, a kind of limitation on the system. The system can show you they're jointly contrary. It's not going to be able to show you that they're not.
So now what should be the outcome?
But again, if we want to show that some sentences are JC, what we do is we take them as assumptions and then we work through a proof until we end in a contradiction. So I'll give you an example here. Here's three sentences. We've got A, we've got if A then B, and we have not B. So we take these three as assumptions, and it's very quick to get a contradiction. We just use 1 and 2 together to give us B through conditional elimination. And then we have not B from our initial assumptions and B that we've derived. So we have our contradiction. Easy peasy. And what this shows is that 1, 2, and 3 can't all be true together. We don't know why, but we know that if they were true together, this is the chain of reasoning that would get you to a contradiction.
And now we go to the second part.
Makes sense for our three notions. We know how to do theorems, we know how to do joint or provable equivalence, and we know how to do joint contraries. The last one is the most obvious one. I will just simply ask for you to show me this. What's this asking for you to do? If I write A1 ... AN, single turnstile C, what am I asking for you to give? Yeah. Just give me a proof that takes A1 through AN as your assumptions, and it ends in C. We've already been doing this sort of thing. Yeah.
Is that not the same thing as provability?
It is. It is. So this is provable, right? That's all we're interested in there. Nice. So kind of coming back, again, what can our system do? What is our system able to do? Right? It can, if I give you a sentence, you can show me that it is a theorem using the system. You cannot use the system to show me that it's not a theorem. Similarly, if I give you two sentences, you can show me that they are provably equivalent by giving me two proofs. but we cannot use this system to show that they are not.
And if
And finally, we can show that some sentences are jointly contrary using the system, like taking them as assumptions and deriving a contradiction. What we can't do is show that they're not jointly contrary.
If two sentences are theorems, would they be not jointly contrary?
Good. They have to be not jointly contrary.
the definition,
So if they're theorems, right? They're theorems. That means we can prove them both from nothing at all. And if being a theorem is a parallel with being a tautology,
you can
then we better hope to God that they're not jointly contrary, because they're always true.
okay, that is correct.
Interestingly, kind of following it up, if two sentences are both theorems, if they're both theorems, what also must be true? If they're both theorems, what also must be true? They have to be provably equivalent. Because what you could do is just assume one of the theorems and then run the proof without ever citing that assumption. And it'll be the same for the other way around. You don't need it, but you can use it. Nice. So again, this is kind of related back to some of the concepts we had before. These are just natural deduction versions of the theorem, or being things like tautology, provable equivalence, joint tautological equivalence, etc., etc., etc. Okay. So there's the kind of conceptual stuff, making sure we understand the ideas. Then there's the actual like practical stuff, in some sense of practical, of actually constructing the proofs. And that's the stuff I want to do in the second half. But I want to finish off by talking about a little bit more conceptual things before our break. So to stress, we have the single turn style. The single turn style expresses provability. The top line there tells us that we can take A1 through AN as assumptions and construct a proof that gets us to C. The double turn style, that tells us that there's no valuation that makes A1 through AN true and C false. Different ideas, different tools to track them. One of them would be tables. One of them would be our natural deduction system. Different notions, but they are fundamentally interconnected. Here's the really cool thing about these two, is that the single turnstile holds if and only if the double turnstile holds, and vice versa. An argument is going to be, or sorry, I should be strict here. We'll say that some sentences are going to tautologically entail a conclusion if and only if it's possible to build a proof with them as assumptions and get to that conclusion, and vice versa. Our natural deduction system perfectly mirrors and is aligned with the truth tables that we taught you earlier. So premises tautologically entail the conclusion if and only if the conclusion can be proved from the premises. Two sentences are tautologically equivalent if and only if they're provably equivalent. And some sentences are jointly tautologically consistent if and only if they are not jointly contrary. So what this means is that, remember all those instances where I told you the natural deduction system is gappy. Like the natural deduction system can't tell you that some sentences are not jointly contrary. We have a tool that does. It's the truth tables. So the important thing to stress here is that the single and double turnstiles are extensionally in agreement. That is, they both say yay or nay to the same arguments. Now, with regards to TFL, this isn't super duper amazing, because truth tables can already do a hell of a lot. But we have a natural deduction system for FOL. And if you remember, when it came to the tool for FOL, what was the tool instead of truth tables we used for FOL? Interpretations. And remember how interpretations were extremely limited. You could use interpretations to show that an argument's invalid. How would you show an argument's valid in first order logic? You didn't have a tool, right? Here's the neat thing. With natural deduction, you can. Because all of the parallels, all the gaps that we just talked about for this TFL natural deduction system, they're also there for the FOL natural deduction system. And it perfectly mirrors the limitations of interpretations. So you can use interpretations to show that an FOL argument is invalid. To show that it's valid, you build a natural deduction proof. To show that some sentences are not logically equivalent, you could build an interpretation. To show that they are, you show they're provably equivalent. It's magic. It's almost like they were designed to fit together.
Everyone, what would be the outcome?
Now, unfortunately, we're not going to go through FOL natural deduction. I'll put some readings if you're interested in it. But all it does is it builds directly on the stuff that we've done. And that's a kind of business decision here. We sometimes do it, sometimes don't. Between friends, it's a mess, and we lose so many people that we just thought, you know what, we'll do something different instead. But it's really worth driving home. That's the kind of big motivation for this natural deduction stuff, right? It highlights how the reasoning works, and it gives you a tool that fills in the gaps. Like the stuff we taught you just haven't yet.
Between A and C.
Okay.
You want that the total support is
So that's really neat. So the last thing I want to do before we take our break, again, take about 5-10 minutes and talk a little bit about general proof strategies. So these general proof strategies are basically some general advice that I can give you about how to approach constructing natural deduction proofs. I want to stress that these are very general. And one big issue with natural deduction is it is not mechanical. That is, you can't just sort of follow it through in a very algorithmic way like you can with a truth table. It requires a little bit of, we'll call it artistry, in a very, very loose sense there. A little creativity. So let me give you 3 suggestions about how to approach these. The first suggestion is one that we talked about in the tutorial already. And it's something that I think it's a very handy first move. And the idea here, a general strategy, is to work backwards. Write your proof down, write your premises down, get your conclusion, and start planning by working backwards. Think about, okay, given that this is where I want to end up, I want to get to this conclusion, what rule am I likely to use last? If it's got an operator, think about using the introduction rule for that operator. If it's an atom, well, you already know it ain't going to be no introduction rule. Now, the reason to do this is it starts to help you. You start to get some idea of what moves you might make in the proof. So you can start to plan. Think through a couple moves, and then kind of just keep working backwards. So, okay, if this is my last line, I'll need to do a subproof that ends with this. Okay, well, what rule am I going to use for that last line in the subproof? Keep doing this until you've got a picture on the whole move. Again, this is a general strategy. I'm giving it to you in very, very vague terms because, frankly, it's not going to work every single time, but it's a good way to start. So there's one. Work backwards. The second bit of advice, annoyingly, is work with what you've been given. So this is something we talked a little bit about in the tutorial. If you're really stuck and working backwards isn't helping, cool. Do this. Look at your assumptions. Think about what elimination or introduction rules you can run just straight off what you started with. Okay, you've got a Conditional and the antecedent. Neat. Well, we know that then we'll be able to get the consequent. Is that going to help us get to wherever we want to go? Hey, there's a conjunction in my premises. Well, let's think about what happens if we use conjunction elimination to get the conjuncts. Is this going to help me? Consider any relevant elimination rules that you can apply. Consider any relevant introduction rules. Are they going to help you? Notably, this works very well in conjunction with the working backwards. Think about what rule you're going to use last to give you some kind of very broad structure, and then use this idea to think about how you might fill in that broad structure. We talked about both of these. The third general bit of advice is actually a particular way to construct proofs. We'll do an example of this in the second half. The third bit of advice is to prove a result indirectly. And an indirect proof works like this. You assume the negation of the thing you want to get to. So if you want to get to P, we would prove it indirectly by starting a subproof with not P. And the aim is to end this subproof in a contradiction. Blah, 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 blah. And we get to a contradiction. Why? Because what we can then do is close the subproof and do negation introduction to give us not P. Which is really handy, because then we're one double negation elimination away from getting the result we want. So it's called proving indirectly, because what we basically show is that not P must be false. And since not P must be false, P has to be true. It's showing you that the other option isn't the case, so we must be left with the sentence we want. This is situational, but it's very handy. Sometimes proving things indirectly is much quicker. In fact, interestingly, there's a couple proofs that can only be done this way. Sometimes, though, you can't do this. This is why it's situational. But it's a thing to kind of have in your back pocket. So again, the 3 bits of advice I can give you. Start from the back, kind of think about what the last move is going to be and use that to sort of structure a plan. Work with what you're given. So think about what elimination and introduction rules you can apply to your basic assumptions. And sometimes think about this idea of proving things indirectly. Proving that the negation of the thing you want leads to a contradiction. So the double negation of it must be true. The last bit of advice is very simple, but probably the best one I can give you, which is don't give up. There's a couple reasons to not give up. One of them is that this kind of thing will make you a better philosopher. You will be better at structuring arguments, at seeing why other people's arguments don't work, or even why the arguments you're giving don't work. What looks like a good step in an argument, you'll suddenly realize isn't. You thought you were using a good bit of reasoning, but it's a mistake. This is one of the reasons to do this. It's a kind of soft skill. We're secretly teaching you to be better philosophers while doing some bullshit mathematics. The other reason to keep persisting, in a much more practical, direct sense, is that I'm not going to give you questions on the final exam and things like this that are insane. I'm going to give you ones that are answerable. They're going to be similar in structure to some of the ones we talked about in homework. So we're going to work through and be prepared for these kinds of questions. So don't give up, right? It's okay. It's fun. It's interesting. Think of it as a fun little puzzle. The other fun thing is, of course, if I do give you one that's too hard or I screw up, you get the points for free. So, but okay. So that's really where, yeah, it's kind of like a super jigsaw, right? 4D chess. Anyway, but no. So these are the things I really wanted to talk about, right? Again, what we have is this concept of being a theorem. We know how to prove them. We have provable equivalence. We know how to do that. We have joint contrariness. We know how to do that. And we also just generally know how to do now this provability. It's just asking for you to give me a proof. Again, conceptually we get it. There's the practical question of if we know how to do it. That's what we're going to talk about in the second half. Okay. Before we break, pause, ask, what questions do you have for me on the stuff we talked about today? At the conceptual level, we feel kind of okay? Yes, please.
I had a question because I was wondering, and I think I also already know the answer, but
Good to
I was
ask.
wondering if you were to do the test and you could get to a proof in like 4 lines, but you did it in 32 lines. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's no problem with extraneous information or doing extra steps. If you go nuts and just spiral into oblivion and then finally right at the end kind of, oh no, it was just this, this, and this, that's totally fine. So don't worry about, oh, I didn't get there in the kind of most precise and most practical way. That's okay. That's okay. As long as the rules are used in the correct way, every move's legal. Cool. Yeah.
Are the symbols for single and double turnstiles based on the logical proofs? Because the proof line and the assumption line, or
I wish it was,
Yeah.
but
Would be
this
useful.
was introduced very much after the kind of definitions of provability and things. But yeah. It's an interesting. So what we're doing here, this particular kind of style of natural deduction with the vertical proofs is a Fitch style. It was basically invented in the late 40s, early 50s. It used to be the way we do natural deduction proofs ends up with ones that are really wide, and they're really annoying to read. This is so much cleaner because it's something that kind of makes sense where you can follow the rules back. Okay. Other questions? Again, let me stress, what we're really interested in right now is just getting a grip on the concepts. We're going to talk through after the break. I'm pointing as if there's a fucking work in the clock.
Yeah.
Shit, we're almost out of time, guys. But again, what I'm really interested in is that you have a grip on the concepts, and we're going to talk about how to use them, how to actually do the kind of proofs after the break. Cool? Beautiful. So, it's almost, I almost got it just right. It's 29. But let's take a break till 12:40, and we'll come back, and then we'll work through some simple problems. Cool.
Yeah.